Today I spoke with Paula Hall. Paula is widely recognised as the UK's leading expert in the field of sex and porn addiction. She's an internationally sought after trainer and lecturer on the topic, and she's also been widely published in the area, having written several books on the topic. She's made numerous media appearances, most notable of which being her excellent TED Talk. In addition to all this and her very successful private practice, she's also head of recovery at the Naked Truth Project. She joined me today for a frank and fascinating discussion, and whilst we don't discuss anything particularly explicit, viewer discretion is of course advised. Well, I'm joined today by Paula Hall, who's one of the world experts on sex and porn addiction. She's also a very sought after trainer of therapists, and I should know because I'm fresh off the back of one of her courses. So I'd just like to say a big thanks for being with us today, Paula.
Very welcome.
I very much enjoyed your course. So again, I really appreciate you doing this because Paula's just done a 4-day course and also just spoken to our clients out of courtesy, which was very kind. So I appreciate you having a chat with me today. So it's a fascinating area. The whole area of sex addiction as a behavioural addiction, which is one which I have to be honest, I feel myself and my colleagues notice a disparity between the knowledge that we have between, say, substance use and also this as a sort of burgeoning behavioural addiction. So I think it would be interesting for people to hear how it is that you yourself got into this area, in a counselling context.
Initially, I trained in drug addiction about 25 years ago, and then I trained as a sexual and relationship psychotherapist. And so I thought, left the addiction world behind a long time ago and was just working in private practice with people with a whole range of kind of different relationship issues and sexual problems. And I'd actually been working with a guy in private practice who was describing these kind of compulsive sexual behaviours. He was having sex with multiple different partners, even though he described himself as being very happily married, 2 children that he absolutely loved and adored, a very successful career, but he was continuing with these behaviours. And coincidentally, there was a conference, a professional conference that I went to where somebody was actually talking about sex addiction, and suddenly, just listening to that speaker for that hour, I realised that actually this is what the client was talking about, and this is going back probably about 15 years now. And I guess because of the old hat that I had, which was about chemical addiction, and then sort of hearing it presented in this sort of cycle of behaviours that get out of control, that people really struggle to stop, it just made sense. I mean, that's going back to 15 years ago. We just about got broadband or dial-up. I mean, it was early stages of the internet, and so I don't think there was quite as much of it around in those days. But certainly I was beginning to see it and decided this was an area that I was really interested in, and I felt that people needed more help.
And it sounds like it's grown, exponentially in terms of your own expertise and your practice since then. This is not a problem.
Absolutely. So for the last 15 years, I mean, it started just as me, and about 8 years ago, I started running groups, and I took on a couple of other therapists to sort of help me run the groups. Now we're a team of 12. The training has completely taken off. We've got the accredited diploma in sex addiction counselling now. And I get to come to Thailand to deliver training, something that was, away from anything I expected to be doing. Yeah,
and I think demonstrates sort of quite nicely, quite profoundly how, as the sort of this advance into the world of technology and more immersive technology, which we'll come on to, we're starting to see just an international explosion of these types of issues, and it seems to be like other addictions in that it has very little respect for, class, race, socioeconomic culture, gender.
Anybody can be affected.
And with your team and as it's grown, I understand that you work primarily in the UK, but as you mentioned, you are now starting to train therapists everywhere, really.
Yeah.
What has been your experience of training other therapists in terms of, you know, the knowledge base that they might have, or what are the things that they are starting to come to terms with that they maybe didn't have before the training?
I think that's what's been a real challenge. So in my experience, having worked and trained with a lot of addiction specialists, the people in the addiction field really understand the process of addiction. They understand how patterns of behaviour can become compulsive. They understand addictive thinking. They understand the absolute commitment to quit, to change their lifestyle, but whatever it might be, to just start up. So the whole notion of relapse, that is very familiar to them. But often what they struggle with is to be able to talk about sex and sexuality in a very open, comfortable way, and to be able to really conceptualise what positive sexuality might be. And actually, because obviously it's not about abstinence, getting into recovery from sex addiction isn't about abstinence. So a lot of my training with addiction professionals has been on about human sexuality and being able to really talk about that with comfort and explore those issues.
Yeah.
The other side of the coin has been where I've been working with a lot of sex therapists. So I also train a lot of sex therapists. Very, very comfortable talking about human sexuality, talking about sexual functioning, talking about the role of sex within our lives and the function of it and the importance of it. But very, very little knowledge and experience of the addictive process.
Yeah. So it seems like there's a lot of people who have one side of the coin but not the other, and it's just about balancing
so I
that
spend
equation.
most of my time training sex therapists in addiction and training addiction therapists in sex.
Yeah, well, that was my experience in terms of the last 4 days. We have quite a multicultural team, which I think is wonderful, but one of the things that, you know, and I have my big mouth ran into was cultural perspectives on that. So I think it was very useful, if not necessarily the most comfortable discussion, to sort of at least standardise and sort of sit with other people's perspective as a team before disseminating any sort of coherent policy amongst your clients. So yeah, thanks for that. I think it was brilliant, and I can see how addiction specialists are really going to lap this type of training up, because you know, if we don't understand it more comprehensively, then how can we possibly help, you know, the clients and then the general public? And I think that's sort of brings us on nicely to a clarification of some of the definitions. So if someone's watching this and, you know, they're wondering about the more basic terms, how would you define sex addiction?
I would define sex addiction as any kind of sexual behaviour, whether that's masturbation, viewing pornography, multiple sexual partners, partnered sex, visiting sex workers, visiting masseurs, cyber sex, any kind of sexual behaviour that begins to feel out of control. So it begins to feel as though actually my desire for this behaviour is controlling me rather than me being able to control it. And critically, it's behaviours that start having harmful consequences. So again, I think the challenge working in this field is you can't measure by units. You can't say X amount of hours having sex per week is okay. Beyond that, it's a problem. It's about the function of the behaviour. So when those sexual behaviours are used rather than simply for sexual enjoyment, they're actually used for emotional regulation. It becomes a way of escaping the problems of life. It becomes a form of escape in the same way as many people might understand or have experienced using alcohol. You know, you don't drink alcohol because you're thirsty. You might drink alcohol because you're thirsty, but I mean, a lot of people are drinking alcohol because they want to change their mood. They want to chill out, or they want to get in the mood to go out, or they want to feel less inhibited. The primary function of it is about changing mood, and I think that's okay sometimes. Similarly, using sex, using masturbation as a way of changing your mood sometimes is absolutely fine, but if it becomes the only way you can do it and you become dependent on it and it's causing problems in your life, but in spite of those problems you still can't reduce your usage, you still can't stop, then perhaps it's an addiction.
And I think that's definitely where the ears would peak of people who are either in recovery, maybe people who have, family or friends who are in recovery or have issues with more substance-based addiction. Is that phrase which is very well known in AA circles and more generally in addiction, my life has become unmanageable.
Yeah.
And that seems to be something that there's a direct parallel from, in terms of, say, porn or sex addiction. Again, not to sort of be pedantic, but more to answer my own question. It seems to be that there is different definitions, and people will say sex addiction and porn addiction, and there was a few terms which came up in terms of, acting out and offline and online, and maybe you could speak a little bit to what this escalation looks like in the world of sex addiction, because it's obvious in alcoholism, it's just, as you say, I drink 4 bottles of red wine a day and I used to drink 3, So what does the escalation pattern tend to look like for?
I suppose that the most common way that I'm seeing sex addiction is starting with pornography use. Mm-hmm. And of course, again, there are lots of people who use pornography recreationally and don't develop any kind of problem. But for some, the pornography use begins to escalate, and often initially it starts escalating by spending more and more time viewing porn. Mm-hmm. So the initial intention being, maybe I'll watch a bit of porn for half an hour and then I'll get to sleep, and then 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 4 hours later, you're still sitting there. Or the type of porn begins to escalate in terms of the genre that you're looking at, so it becomes more and more hardcore in some way. And again, that's not about making a moral judgment about what kind of pornography is okay.
Sure.
But a lot of people notice in escalation they're beginning to view images and material that normally just would not generally excite them. Also, we know that on the porn sites you start seeing the adverts for cybersex, the adverts for sex workers, for adult dating sites, as they're sometimes referred to, or getting involved in other types of sexual behaviours. So it escalates into that, and the point at which a lot of people come to me for help is because what started as being all online behaviours has actually now gone offline.
Right.
So they may not feel that they are being unfaithful to their partner by viewing porn, but then when they're chatting to sex workers online, they're not quite so sure. Then when they're actually visiting a sex worker or meeting strangers for sex, okay, this is definitely infidelity now, and this is definitely not where I want to be and how I want to live my life.
And it seems to be a couple of interesting things there in that, again, analogous to maybe the more substance-based addictions, that there are, gateway behaviours in as much as there are gateway drugs, and that's a controversial term, but the escalation, like I did this and then I did X and then I did Y, and it also sounds like the porn industry is probably more up to date on the psychological ramifications than maybe some of the therapists are, so they know how to advertise.
They know how to hook in.
They're the best. They're catching all the fish, if you know what I mean. So maybe could you describe a situation in which someone starts to really run up against their own value system, and then that's when they seek help? I mean, what does that tend to look like with the clients that you're seeing in terms of how they present?
The most typical client is going to be perhaps the guy who's got a very stressful job, very busy lifestyle. Maybe he drinks a little bit too much when life's stressful, goes away on business trips, maybe when he's away. That's when typically he might look a bit of pornography. Maybe there's a bit of recreational drug use that kind of happens when he's away. And, initially he's thinking, well, this is just helping me through this particular stressful period. This is just something that I do when I'm away. Then he finds he's at home, he's not away on business, but actually he's having a stressful time at work again, so computer gets flicked on, starts looking at porn midweek. Then he's got a difficult time at the office, he's got a business meeting he's got to go to, big presentation, feeling a bit anxious. I might just watch a bit of porn on my iPhone before I go in. So is already aware that pornography use has gone from just being occasionally when I'm away to happening at home during the day on a regular basis. Then the curiosity starts. So there's the sex worker adverts, and it's kind of, I've always been quite curious, maybe visited sex workers in the past. Not something I would do, but I'm quite curious to see what they look like. Start flicking on the adverts, start finding out how much they cost, finding out that actually maybe they are available in the town that he's going to be visiting on business. And often it's a while before that line is actually crossed.
Yeah.
But before he knows it, he's paying a sex worker to leave his hotel room, and he has broken his marriage vows. And it's not something that he ever intended to do.
Which again we hear time and time again in at Dara here, and then we hear life stories. We get people to we don't get them to, we help them to relay that so that they can develop a solidarity and an awareness of their life narrative. But time and time again we hear something like that where it's, and then he left, or then I hit him, and I just never thought this would have happened. And so how would you advise people, maybe someone's watching who is starting to, their ears are pricking up thinking, I have started to dabble in those behaviours but I haven't done anything yet. Would you have any strategies for people that wouldn't necessarily define themselves as in any way a sex addict, but they are noticing behaviours which might lead down that slippery slope?
I mean, in many respects, I don't think we ever know we're addicted to something until we actually try and stop or cut down. So, all the time that, having that glass or two of wine, that half a bottle of wine, that bottle of wine isn't stopping you getting up and going to work tomorrow. We tell ourselves it's not a problem, we're okay, we're functional, it's fine. It's not until you actually go, you know what, I'm going to stop drinking midweek, I'm going to put some boundaries around this, and you find yourself, climbing up the walls with frustration, that you realise it's a problem. Cut back for a while, decide, right, okay, I think there's nothing wrong with pornography, it's fine to look at pornography, but I'll only look at pornography when my partner's away, or I'll just make it something I do on Sunday evenings, whatever, but I won't the rest of the week. See how it goes. Or some of my guys will just get an egg timer or alarm clock and say, okay, I will watch porn for 30 minutes, and then that's it. Because I suppose the other way I see it escalate with some of the single clients I work with, and I work with a lot of single clients, is that what started as a recreational habit has now taken over so much time. So it started with, I'm going to watch half an hour's porn to help me get focused so I can get that report done. So I can write that essay for school, for university or whatever. It's just going to, it's just going to help me kind of focus. 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 4 hours later.
They're still there.
They're still there.
And they're on some site that they never thought that they very much doubt they would be on a similar site that they were to begin with.
So it's kind of, can you hold your own boundaries on this?
I mean, I think that's part of the point of our discussion, I think, is to give people some sensibility, some empathy that this is like a desire-based thing, that this is an addiction thing. And as you mentioned throughout the course, it's not really anything about sex. It seems like escalation of your own pathways in your brain. So I've heard people talk about the YouTube rabbit hole. It's nothing to do with sex, but they are 3-4 hours into looking at cat videos, and they're thinking, well, I really needed to do that essay, and I'm not going to be able to do that now. So hopefully, I think people can relate with how incandescent that drive to just click the next thing can be, regardless what the image, what that image is. So whenever I was asking you to sort of to describe, in a way, I suppose, a typical client, I think a lot of people would have that personification in their head that it's, there are a few different archetypes, let's say, but there's the 40-year-old businessman who, has his wife and kids at home, goes off to Hong Kong and plays away. You'd mentioned that the stats might surprise people in terms of the gender balance, but that's not necessarily represented in the people who attend for treatment. So I was wondering, could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, the research I did for my book, so I wrote a book on sex addiction which came out about 3 years ago, and I did a survey of just kind of an open survey through SurveyMonkey on the internet of 350 people. And it was basically an open invitation. If you think you're struggling with sex addiction, then please can you, you know, complete this survey for this book I'm writing. So yeah, 350 people responded to that, and 30% were women. And I was really quite surprised because at that point I'd probably worked with, I don't know, I'd been working in it about 5 or 6 years, I guess, and I'd probably worked with, I don't know, 100, 150 guys and 1 woman in that time. So I was really surprised. And actually, the first thing I did was actually check the research and thought, hey, if they thought I mean, are you a partner of?
Yeah, sure.
Clearly not, because they had completed the survey. And actually, that 30% matches some of the research that's been done in the US as well, suggesting that 30% of people with sex addiction is women. But and again, this is matched by what happens in the US. Women don't tend to come forward for help. There's a real gender difference. I think a lot of that is down to social perceptions. And I think perhaps this is around sex. This is the one area where guys potentially feel slightly less shame coming forward for help. That they are compulsively using pornography. They're having a lot of sexual encounters. Because social connotations, and this is common in a lot of cultures, it's certainly not just within our culture. You know, a guy that has a lot of sex he's a bit of a lad. He's one of the boys. He's a man. He's a typical man. Whereas a woman is still in most cultures going to be defined as easy, cheap, maybe a bit of a slut.
Yeah.
So actually coming forward for help as a woman who's struggling with sex addiction is often much, much harder. Some women would prefer to define themselves as a love addict rather than a sex addict, and kind of putting much more of the focus on the way that they are using sex to try and find validation, to try and kind of find a sense of kind of affection and attention, and they're kind of using it for that. But in my experience, that is often what men are doing as well. But perhaps there's something within the sort of the cultural context, which means it's much easier for men to say I'm addicted to sex than I need some attention. And it's much easier for women to say I want some attention than I'm hooked on sex.
I think that I'd heard someone say once that, you know, I was talking about adolescent males and females and the way that they tend to interact, and it was boys will play with love for sex and girls will play with sex for love, and but ultimately there is some wisdom, I suppose, because they converge, and basically both genders are looking for the same thing.
Absolutely.
There is a void that is pretty homogenous across the genders. So that sort of, excuse my language, but we are talking about sex addiction, so I suppose we shouldn't dance around certain words. That player versus slut, you know, societal model. How do we shift that?
We've been trying to shift that for generations. Generations and generations. And I so wish it was different now, and it isn't. I think women certainly have a lot more sexual freedom, a lot more opportunities to express their sexuality now than they ever did before, and that's great. I think that's a really, really good thing. But unfortunately, the morality around it still hasn't changed, and a lot of I've done a lot of kind of youth work over the years as well, and a lot of young guys, they'd be like, you know, they think it's great that the girls have got just as much sexual equality and they can go out there and they can get what they want and they can enjoy casual sex. They think that's absolutely great, but there might not be girlfriend material. There's still kind of that
tainted nature, which is a fairly brutal indictment on our culture and how we still relate to different aspects of sexuality between the genders. Now, again, maybe one sort of paradigm that I'm playing into is the men looking for women and women looking for men, which of course is very, you know, centric around heterosexual relationships. So is there any difference that you've noticed between how this plays out in different sexual orientations, and also maybe to come on to a little bit about in that question also the difference between sexuality and sensuality and that sort of spectrum that you sort of alluded to a lot in the diploma?
Certainly I've worked with a lot of gay guys. There's a lot of gay guys struggling with sexually compulsive behaviours, whether that's watching pornography, multiple relationships, cruising, going to the saunas, whatever it is. And I think whenever we're working with people from a different sexual orientation from our own, we need to be, we need to be sensitive to the different kind of diversities that there are out there. And, growing up gay is not easy. It's obviously different for everybody. Some have an easier time of it than others. But depending on your culture, depending on your family of origin, you may have struggled more or less with how it felt to be gay, coming out as gay. And for some guys, there's already been a whole load of shame loaded on them, and that might be from their family of origin, it might be from their cultural surroundings, or indeed from our heteronormative society that we still continue to live in, which means that can compound those feelings of sexual shame they have when they're trying to find the sexual lifestyle that kind of fits their identity. And I think, perhaps the thing we've not talked about yet is another real key difference working in sex addiction as opposed to within the other addiction fields is the amount of morality that's involved in it. And there are a lot of people who still think that labelling anybody as a sex addict or a porn addict is in some way making a moral judgment, and that anybody who's not just having heterosexual sex within marriage must be a sex addict. And of course that is absolute rubbish. And I think ultimately the definition of sex addiction is going to be that you're not actually leading a sexual lifestyle of your choice. It's something that feels imposed on you by your addiction as opposed to something that's of choice. So within the gay community, what their choice of healthy, positive sexual lifestyle might be may be quite different from the single guy, the single woman, the married couple, the different sexual orientations, different cultures, different classes, different contexts. Our definition of that is going to always be different, but it needs to be about our choice. Personally. And I think if you're not living the sexual lifestyle that you want to lead and you're not able to change it, maybe there's an issue.
So it seems interesting to see how shame compounds different elements, but obviously to differing extents between people, depending on their lifestyle, and also there's obviously.
And I think it's important to distinguish between the shame that is experienced by the type of behaviours they're involved in. So some of my clients may feel shame that they are watching BDSM porn, for example, or they're visiting sex workers and they actually think that is exploitative and perhaps they shouldn't. But many of my clients don't feel shame about their sexual behaviours. They're very happy with the fetish or the kink or whatever it is that they're into. They don't have an issue with that. They don't have an issue with paying for sex. Where their shame comes from is the people they're hurting, the vows that they're breaking in doing that, or indeed just their dependency on it. So I remember one young client quite recently saying, I know that lots and lots of young guys look at porn. I know this is normal. But not like I do.
It's interesting.
Not to this extent.
that what's normative and also what's sort of pressured by society. I think what's fascinating about this area is how you always end up seeming to get back to tapping some sort of primeval wells of the human psyche, and how comfortable or uncomfortable that makes different sections of society. I think is fascinating, and I think that's something I'd love to pick your brains about in part 2. Today I'm speaking with Paula Hall. Paula is one of the UK's leading experts in the fields of sex and porn addiction. In part 2, in addition to discussing the societal pressures that people suffering from these conditions often have to contend with, and what positive sexuality might actually look like for the individual. Paula gives us the neuroscientific basis for these maladaptive behaviours.
So one way of thinking about the brain is that basically we have three parts.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got the basic reptilian brain, which is all about survival. Yeah, all it cares about is survival. Fight, flight, freeze. That's all it's responsible for, is keeping us alive. It's the part of the brain that acts the fastest. If somebody bursts through here, straight into that part of the brain. We then have a limbic system bit of brain, and that's where a lot of the emotions kind of reside, is where our sense of kind of feeling resides. If you think about the way that a child grows up, initially a newborn baby is only interested in survival, and they don't really experience emotions in the same way as you got. But then when they get to about 2 or 3, they start experiencing a lot more emotions. They may not have the language for it yet, but they certainly experience those emotions. So that's kind of the emotional brain coming online. And a lot of our sexual desires and our appetites happen within that part of the brain. Yeah, it's when you get to about 2 or 3, maybe a bit younger, where you start wanting chocolate biscuits.
Yeah.
Newborn babies just need to eat food to survive. You start really developing your taste and what you would prefer to eat when you start hitting toddlerhood. Final part of the brain that comes online is the neocortex. That's the thinking brain. That's all about reason. That's all about logic. So let's go back to the chocolate biscuit analogy. Newborn baby does not need chocolate biscuits for survival. It knows that. And as individuals, we don't need sex for survival. We do for the species, obviously, but for our own individual survival, we don't need sex. Emotional part of the brain starts telling us that, yeah, we want chocolate biscuits and they're really nice. And actually, we'd like to eat them all the time.
Yeah.
We'd like them for breakfast, we'd like them for lunch, we'd like them for dinner every single day, please.
Yeah.
We would like a diet purely of that. So in sexual terms, we'd like to have sex. We'd like to have sex with lots of people, all of the time, whenever we want it. That's what we would like. That is what our desire is. The thinking brain kicks online and says, you know what, chocolate biscuits are really nice. Nothing wrong with the occasional hobnob, that would be my favourite. Nothing wrong with the occasional chocolate biscuit, but actually it's not good for us to have them all the time. We need a balanced diet. Yeah. And our thinking brain helps to control the emotional brain to have a bit of common sense and make some rational decisions. So you're helping that toddler, as they get older, use the thinking brain to make some decisions about what is going to be positive for them.
Sure.
So again, we need to rely on that thinking brain in terms of our sexual desires. So whilst in the emotional brain, it may be very natural to want and have all these desires, our thinking brain, we rely on our thinking brain to tell us, yeah, but if I sleep with every person I meet, that's probably not going to be wise.
Yeah.
There's going to be unwanted pregnancy at some stage, there's going to be STIs. It kind of contradicts some of the other things that I want in life. So I quite like to have a stable home, I quite like to have, this, that. It's going to make it difficult for that. So we rely on our thinking brain to make decisions which are actually going to be in our best interests. And what happens in addiction basically is that the emotional brain is in charge. The thinking brain gets weaker and weaker, they call it hyperfrontality, becomes weaker and weaker, and the dopamine system within the emotional brain gets stronger and stronger. So our desires become much, much bigger and much greater than our rational ability
to control them. Yeah. So it's like that when that arm wrestle reaches a critical mass, the arm of satiation of dopamine as opposed to pleasure, and I think that's something we should distinguish. You mentioned a lot about that in the diploma. When that overpowers, the ability for the more executive functions to say, okay, that's enough hobnobs. I laugh because I think I think my limbic. If you put me in an fMRI machine, you've cued me for hobnobs. You can't get them in Thailand, so. So
I'm
Niall,
sorry.
I think that's a fascinating, area that that you didn't say sex at any point in that. You were talking about addiction, and I think that's something that we will come on to.
Desires and appetites.
Desires, and I think that term is very useful, and Mark Lewis has written an excellent book on that topic about how, because desire, I feel as a word, has a currency in the mainstream. Everyone has a desire. I'm drinking tea, it's got caffeine in it. You know, I'm drinking it partly for the taste and also partly because it has, you know, caffeine. So hopefully if more of our, you know, mental health world starts to, you know, spread that message, the mainstream will start to appreciate that, okay, people with addictions have very, very strong desires, and a mismatch between the strength of the desire and their ability to control those desires, and but we're all on a spectrum. So
Absolutely.
Maybe speak a little bit about that hypofrontality. Are there any instances where that might emerge, like maybe conditions, if people have had head injuries, for example? You know, are there any sort of demographics that you're seeing sex addiction more prominently in?
It's not necessarily directly linked to the brain, but I mean, certainly we know, I mean, addictions develop over time.
Sure.
Yeah. And some of us are more susceptible to developing addictions than others. Some of that is hereditary. We don't exactly know what the sort of genetic component of it is, but we know that people who have got parents who have some kind of addiction are more likely to develop addiction themselves. Mm-hmm. We know that people who struggle with some mental health problems may be more likely to develop addictions. People who have ADHD may be more likely to develop addictions. And there's also kind of risk factors. So people who've had difficult childhoods, had problems in their family of origin, people who've experienced trauma, they may also be at a greater risk of developing addiction. But as well as those kind of risk factors, there's also the simple element of exposure. Yeah, you are more likely to develop an alcohol addiction if you are surrounded by alcohol and people who drink. It's kind of pretty obvious. Yeah. And I suppose one of our challenges as a society now is that we are actually in an environment which is saturated with internet pornography that is easily accessible by anybody, anywhere, anytime. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is at least we have education out there and plenty of service, well, maybe not plenty of services, but some services out there for people who do get caught up in alcohol addiction, and obviously to a certain extent in chemical addictions, but we don't yet have it with sex and porn. So we are increasing the availability and the exposure, but we are not keeping pace in terms of education and services. I
think that's a really interesting point, and you'd mentioned obviously about this mismatch between ability to control your behavioural output with regards to satiating desires and the size of those desires. I think we find ourselves in a very interesting position where the average kid, boy or girl, doesn't matter, who's like under the age of, 20 now, has never known a pre-broadband internet.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden we have these developing prefrontal cortices and a perfect storm of that with exponentially increasing access to sexual images. I would imagine that people who work with kids, teachers, counsellors, child psychologists, are really lamenting, what is it that we do? So is it a losing battle, or is there any way that we can police the there isn't really any way that we can police the exposure to these? So is it education, or what would be your broad stroke?
We need to do whatever we can, I believe, to protect young people and vulnerable people from pornography, particularly from extreme pornography. But let's not kid ourselves. Young people are going to find it. Yeah. So we say in the UK you're not allowed to buy alcohol until you're 18. Just go into any kind of public space and you're going to find a whole bunch of teenagers drinking. But at least we do educate them about it. We do talk about it openly. Yeah. So to simply think by putting porn blockers on various sites and whatever is going to help them is just naive.
Yeah.
we need to do what we can, but that alone is not enough.
No.
There's got to be the education
Mm-hmm.
as well. And I think young people are a lot more savvy than we give them credit for. I mean, there was a piece of research done a little while ago asking young people if they thought pornography could become addictive, and the vast majority said yes. And this was about 5 years ago, and it was interesting because that was when there were so many debates about whether or not pornography was addictive amongst the grown-ups.
Yeah.
The kids knew.
Yeah.
They knew it.
Mm-hmm.
They're not stupid, but they do need to know what the signs might be,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to have the people they can turn to, knowing there won't be any kind of moral judgment or stigma if they are beginning to struggle.
I wonder then, ironically, there might be a moralizing which we run up against on the other side of the coin, whereby if people start to suggest, oh well, maybe we should limit the exposure of children to certain images. There's too much sex on the television, and it doesn't necessarily need to be pornographic images. There can be music videos. You can't watch a music video now without seeing a decent bit of flesh. There might be a backlash if there's too much vocalization of, oh, we need to limit children's exposure.
And that's the problem.
As though it's coming from on high,
People are worrying we're going to turn into a nanny state. We're trying to censor freedom of expression. We're trying to censor the industry. It's about getting the balance. And I think it's also just understanding the different. We've always had some kind of censorship on pornography.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, I was speaking at a conference a while ago where there were a lot of people from the porn industry there, the porn producers there, and they were lamenting the days when you had to pay for pornography, partly because they're not making as much money and pornography is mostly free nowadays. But also, when you had to pay for pornography, before we had the tube sites, you had to put your credit card details in. Mm-hmm. That in itself made it much, much harder for young people under the age of 18 who can't get credit cards, generally,
mm-hmm.
to access it. Of course, they might steal their parents. But when you did have to pay for porn, this was considerably less of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
When you did have to go to a newsagent, buy it off the shelf, rent a DVD, or pay for it online. So we've always had some kind of censorship, but the new technology that we have, the new mediums we have for distribution, means we need to refocus, we need to change it. We don't need more censorship than before, we just need to make sure it is technologically relevant.
And that the education keeps pace with the content, I suppose. And to come on to the education around safety and how to promote positive sexuality, which we'll come on to. You work with a charity called The Naked Truth, is that correct?
Yeah, Naked Truth.
There's an excellent video which I'll link in the show notes, which is a time lapse of you explaining metaphorically how addiction, and again, can be, doesn't matter if it's alcohol or sex or whatever, how that is now conceptualized as developing in the brain by people who maybe think, I think we're thinking a bit more broader than it's just purely a disease, let's say, which is a whole other beyond the scope of this talk. Could you maybe just give us an outline of the sort of that wonderful metaphor, the road to Brighton?
The road to Brighton, which is the Brighton Tourist Board are probably going to... No one in Thailand is going to want to go to Brighton. I'm going to get in so much trouble. Brighton is a lovely, lovely place, and I lived in Brighton for many years. I use Brighton as a metaphor for the acting out behaviour, the drug of choice. So you're right, it could be any drug, any substance, any behaviour. It could be gambling, gaming, pornography, Facebook, drugs, alcohol, anything. And if you think that your everyday life is living in London, basically what happens is every time you want your drug of choice, you're creating a neural pathway in your brain. And that neural pathway gets stronger and stronger and stronger the more often you go there. We've known this for years. This is the basis of learning. It's just the principles of learning. Yeah. If I practice the piano on a regular basis, then I will become very, very good at the piano, and I will have a neural pathway to piano playing that is very well developed. And really, ultimately, people with addictions are people who've practiced a lot. And recovery is about stopping practicing. The reason I use Brighton as the metaphor is because Brighton is quite an exciting, interesting place, but it was also a helpful metaphor in terms of helping people to see, I hope, how much addiction actually limits their choices and how it actually dampens their ability to find healthy rewards and, well, any kind of rewards in life. Because the more often you go to that drug of choice, the more often you do that, the less you are expanding the neural networks to other places, so to other coastal towns, if you like. So often what happens, if you keep going to the same place all the time, is the others become less and less interesting, more and more boring. And, I mean, you'll know this from working in chemical addiction, someone who's become very dependent on cocaine will find life extremely bland and boring without it. People who get hooked on the kind of high-risk sexual encounters, visiting sex workers, pornography, multiple affairs, start finding normal sex really boring. They might start finding spending time with their friends and family boring. And that is not just psychological, and I think that's why I wanted to produce the video to try and get some metaphor for it, is so many people think it's some kind of psychological issue or some moral failing within themselves, where in actual fact it's biological. It's not just psychological, it's biological. You are genuinely screwing up your brain's reward system, and life will become more and more and more boring, as indeed will you, the more your addiction takes hold.
And another point, I suppose, about that is one of the sort of the hallmarks, let's say, of addiction, regardless what it is, in that neurological sense, is a development of a tolerance and a subsequent escalation of the use. So, and we've obviously touched on how that can happen from the sort of transition from offline or online to offline, and everyone who's involved in addiction will know how that can play out in the more chemical-based addictions. I suppose my question for you is, how does that sort of map onto the that sort of neurological map? You've mentioned that other parts of life will just become more boring. What is a step to at least begin to reverse that process in early recovery?
I mean, ideally stop completely. It's I think you're sort of asking about how kind of escalation happens. I mean, basically, the way I describe it to clients is that if you imagine that you've got a loudspeaker with a volume control on it, and you're listening to something, if you keep turning up the volume, it's going to get really loud. So what you're most likely to do is actually start covering your ears, so you because it's just too loud to protect yourself, and that's what happens to the receiving neuron in the brain. But the more you close down that your ability to hear, the more you'll turn the volume up. So that's why escalation happens, because you're becoming deaf to it. So turn the volume up, become more deaf, turn the volume up, become more deaf, turn the volume up, become more deaf. And of course, you're not just becoming deaf to that noise, you're becoming deaf to all
noises.
Initially, when you get into recovery, you turn the volume off. So if you're going into complete abstinence, you're turning the volume off completely, and actually you're not going to be able to hear anything. And it's pretty tough, the early stages of recovery, whether that's chemical addiction or one of the behavioural addictions, any kind of addiction, because initially life just feels flat and empty. And again, I think if you're going to help people to understand this is actually biological, not psychological, it will change, because gradually over time those receptors will start to open up again. So when you stop flooding it, the receptors will start to open up and you'll begin to start hearing again. And the great news is you'll be able to hear, not just the great loud cacophony of the whatever those little bugs are that are so noisy here, but you'll be able to hear all the different nuances of sound. And life really can become pleasurable again. Sex can be better than it's ever been before. Sex will not become more boring, it will become better, because you won't need to have that super loud, high-spiced sex all the time. You'll be able to really develop a palate that can enjoy a whole variety of different sexual experiences. Heaven
forbid you can just go straight past Brighton and through the Eurotunnel and end up somewhere in France. So to talk a little bit then about that sort of shift that we've moving people past this active addiction. What does the term positive sexuality, what does that look like? What could you maybe give us some insight into how you expound that with your clients and in your practice?
I think everyone's idea of what is going to be positive sexuality is going to be different. And I very deliberately use the term positive sexuality rather than healthy sexuality, because whenever we start talking about healthy sexuality, start thinking about the kind of sex that might be good for us. Yeah. And actually, I mean, a lot of food is meant to be good for us. Food is has nutrients and it's meant to feed us. Sex isn't necessarily meant to be good for us. It's allowed to just be fun. Yeah. And just be a positive experience. But sex. So for each person, deciding what is a positive sexual experience and what isn't is going to be different. And one of the exercises I give to the people that I work with quite early on in their treatment is to think about which are the sexual behaviours that for them are definitely positive, which behaviours are in line with their values, make them feel positive and good about themselves, they build their self-esteem, they're enjoyable, they're respectful, which are those behaviours that are definitely okay for them, and then to actually think about the behaviours that aren't okay. For a lot of people there's kind of a grey area in the middle, so quite a common one would be okay, so I know pornography is not good for me, it's not positive, I can never be on for 5 minutes, I'm always on for 5 hours, so I won't look at pornography. But what about those dance videos that you were talking, those music videos that you were talking about earlier? Is that okay? You kind of have to, some people have to find out for themselves whether or not they really can just watch a music video, or if they're just going to be 2 clicks away to going to something else. Back to it, but yeah, everybody's idea of what is positive is going to depend on their individual circumstances and their personal value system and cultural heritage. Yeah,
so it sounds like orienting positive sexuality on a client-by-client basis around their core personal values. Yeah. And just sort of to summarise, one technique that you'd mentioned, which we are finding is really effective with just chemical-based addictions, is the area of mindfulness. Yeah. How does that play out for people who are in recovery from sex addiction? I would imagine that they struggle with that initially. What would be your advice? Are there any resources that you would give to people? Obviously, there's therapy that's ongoing, whether with counsellors or with your company. Are there any resources that you would maybe like to highlight for people that you found useful for past clients?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's nothing in particular I can think of at the top of my head in terms of resource, but I mean, mindfulness for recovery is so important at so many different levels. So we were talking earlier about that survival brain, emotional brain, and the thinking brain. What we know about mindfulness is that it strengthens the connection between the three. So actually, the more mindfulness type exercises you engage in, the faster the thinking brain will connect to the emotional brain and to the survival brain. So it is very important. But mindfulness is also a great skill for being able to really enjoy kind of the present moment and really getting in touch with your own sexuality again. So the metaphor that I often use, I'm talking to guys that particularly young guys who perhaps have only masturbated with pornography, to really think about the alternative of masturbating mindfully is, if you've got a beautiful meal in front of you, are you going to eat that meal and watch a cookery program at the same time? Because that's kind of what you're doing. Yeah?
Very good metaphor.
Probably not. Yeah. And actually, if you want to really enjoy that meal that is being put in front of you, turn the telly off and focus on that meal. Imagine that you have just gone to a really, really expensive restaurant. You're being cooked for by the finest chef. This is your one chance to eat that meal. You're not going to sit down and go, can you put the telly on for
Stick
us?
Nigella Lawson on there. I'm at the shard, but stick her on.
You are going to enjoy every single morsel. You are going to really taste it and really enjoy that meal.
Yeah.
And basically learning about your own sexuality is a very similar process about learning to really enjoy what's in front of you, as it were. I
haven't even said this word yet, but I don't think it's possible to talk in a therapeutic way without saying the word journey, but it really is a journey.
Yes.
Paula, I really want to thank you for a really incredibly enlightening chat, and the course was fantastic. If people are watching this and they want to either get in touch with you or your company, where's the best place for them to find you?
Just have a look at paulahall.co.uk.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed what I found to be a really fascinating discussion. I'd also like to take this opportunity to say a big thanks to Paula for being so gracious with her time while she was here with us at Dara Ko Chang. If you have any questions or queries about any of the things that we discussed, or if you'd like to recommend someone to be a future guest on our interviews or podcasts, then please don't hesitate to contact me on the email address you see on screen.